Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Reed Stone. Along with me is my co-host, Bob Foley, and our guest today is Gary Foster. Gary's a former healthcare recruiter, a portfolio career guy, and audacious ager dedicated to helping folks in the over 50 crowd adopt a new, healthier, and more purposeful perspective on the second half of life. Gary has certifications as a retirement coach, a resume writer, and a LinkedIn profile expert, plus over 18 years of career coaching and recruiting experience. He coaches, speaks, and writes on the issues of midlife career transitions, planning a purposeful retirement, and achieving better health and greater longevity. You can read more about Gary on his website, which is Make Aging Work, and we'll share Gary's contact information and his blog and website at the end of the episode. Gary, thanks for joining Bob and I on today's episode.
Well, I'm flattered that you would consider me for your program. Thank you. Yeah. Golly, you read that bio. No wonder I'm busy.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully we can touch on some of that as we go along here. So Bob and I were excited to have you on, Gary. Again, as I've told you, and just for people who are viewing the show, Bob and I have known Gary for a long time. We're all members of the Retirement Coaches Association. I think all of us kind of met at the last in-person Retirement Coaches Association conference. Gary, I think you and I may have connected prior to the conference. I had a previous version of this show called Beyond the Numbers, which was directed more at people approaching retirement, and Gary was a guest on that show. I think a 3-time guest on that show, which we touched on a lot of different topics. I followed Gary's writing for a long time on Make Aging Work, and I think, Gary, you've been writing a weekly blog on your website for over 2 years now. Is that correct?
5.5.
5.5? I had no idea. I had no idea it was that much.
Well, actually, it'll be 6 years in August. 6 years ago, I published my first blog, and
okay,
I guess must have 275 or 280 articles out there floating around. So,
what motivated you to do that, Gary?
I'm sorry, Bob.
What motivated you to do that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think at the time I just really wanted to satisfy kind of a deep inner desire to write more and to be a writer. I mean, and that's a whole nother part of my story, is that I guess I really had to acknowledge that, I really had a talent and a skill in that area that I had really not acknowledged. And this was just a way I decided to kind of jump in and do it. And plus, driven by a deep-seated passion about health and wellness, life transition. At the time I was well past that midlife point in my life, I guess. And, it just kind of felt natural to start writing about that, because someone told me, if you want to be a writer, the thing you probably should do is write. So I just said, okay, I'm going to write. And they also said, you want to be consistent. So I've been fortunate to be able to hold to a weekly blog now for 5.5 years. So, I hope that's an answer for you. That's really, I think, what was primarily my motivation behind it. So,
Gary, let's jump into that just a little bit more and take us back to when you started thinking about retirement and reading and writing about. I know you started 5 years ago, but this probably goes way back in your past. I know you had a corporate career for a long time. You switched over into entrepreneurship. So when did that kind of happen, and what was your thinking during that time?
With regard to retirement?
Yeah, or as you were, I'm guessing it had to do with some of what you were reading about longevity and this whole concept of, and we'll cover this a little bit later, about the 20-40-20 kind of track of life. And
right. And well, I think my view on retirement really, I mean, I have to go all the way back to my origin, quite honestly, because it had some influence, I think, on my view of retirement. I grew up in small town, rural agricultural Wyoming. I mean, town of 800. And retirement was never a discussion topic. I mean, people mostly self-employed, farmers, ranchers, that sort of thing. I mean, retirement was never a discussion topic. I mean, you just worked till you couldn't. And at that point in time, there was a lot of, still, I think, a lot of respect for the elderly. You took care of people. I mean, this retirement just wasn't a discussion topic. And certainly as I finished college, got into the corporate world, it became, a topic. But I think I was heavily influenced, right, when I think back in the 80s, although I was well into a corporate career at that point. In the early 80s, I began to immerse myself in the self-development world.
Okay.
And started reading a lot, listening to a lot of folks. At that time, it was, on tape, that sort of thing. But there were several things that came to my mind as I went into that phase. One of them was that when you look at people that were highly successful, I mean, real world changers, typically they stayed in the creative process as long as they could. I mean, they fundamentally did not retire. But there were also some other events about that time that influenced my thinking. One was the death of my father-in-law. He was 45 years with one company, with an oil company, took his gold watch retirement, and died 10 months to the day after his retirement, after having been given a full, clean bill of health 3 days prior by a physician. And he died of a massive heart attack. And when I thought about that, my wife and I've talked about this a lot, he just seemed lost. He was just kind of drifting. He didn't have that sense of purpose. And I think that influence really, it may have played a role in his early demise. But then in my reading, I ran across other things that just kind of told me that I'm not sure this traditional retirement model makes a lot of sense. I think it was IBM, certainly the Social Security Administration some time ago published a study that said that the average number of pension checks for people who retired was somewhere in the vicinity of 25 to 30, which said that a lot of people were dying within 2 to 3 years after their retirement. So I'm saying, what's going on here? I mean, there's something perhaps even just biologically going on here that doesn't make a lot of sense. So that, frankly, influenced my thinking about, retirement in general. Now, I will have to admit there's been an evolution here, because when I got engaged in the corporate world, and I was in the telecom world for a while with MCI, some of your listeners may remember that debacle. But, we were heavily involved in the dot-com boom. And man, I was all in on that. I can remember starting an investment club, and I was watching my stock portfolio every day. And I watched myself climb up to millionaire status and then watch it all go away. And so I'm thinking, doesn't make a whole lot of sense either. So, and that quite frankly, influenced my decision to try to go off on my own. So that's a whole different story right there. But I think that's, and the more I've immersed myself in thinking and studying and reading about this, the more I've come to the conclusion that, it's a model that was designed for political purposes 88 or 89 years ago. It's when we brought union leaders and business owners and the government together to solve a problem, and it's never evolved away from that concept. But it's time. I mean, I think it's time for that model to really kind of dissolve. And I think that's what we're seeing, is that we're now questioning the traditional retirement model in a big way. And I think that'll continue to evolve. And I'm certainly I'm supportive of that. I don't intend to retire. I'll work till I can't, because frankly, I'm doing what I like to do, that I'm good at, and to get paid for it. And it, provides a valid service for people. So, and that's what I espouse, especially for people in that midlife point, with a 45 or 50 or 55 or whatever. I do find that people that are in their maybe 70s and 80s are a little less receptive to that idea, and perhaps it's a little bit too late to turn the ship in that regard. But I think reaching out to the people at that midlife point with this different message is part of what drives me in my writing and in my my conversations with people. So that was kind of bounced around with that response, but that's really kind of where I come from in it.
Well, that's good. I think we're starting to see that more and more, that people are looking at retirement in a little different way. And I think you were way at the forefront of this with your reading, particularly, and with your story of, you know, seeing this in your family and growing up not having retirement wasn't even a thing. And so, yeah, I think that's a great story. Tell us a little bit more, Gary, because I've heard you write about this, about finding clarity of purpose or your process of discovery.
Well, that's been a really kind of an interesting part of my journey, I guess, because like probably both you and Bob, I mean, I bought into the 20th century linear life model, which, we touched on the 20-40-20 plan, if you will, or I put it, I say, it's the learn, earn, adjourn, and die model. I mean, that's what most of us have bought into. And, I was all in on that, on the corporate thing. And when the wheels came off at WorldCom, I know that I was never completely happy in the corporate environment, just too independent in my thinking. And I figured, well, now would be the time, because they wanted me out and I wanted out. And it was just prior to them going bankrupt. So I took an early severance and decided I'll just jump in to start my own business. And we can talk about how not to do that, because I've got great advice in that area. But I think in this process of going out on my own has been quite an evolution for me. And over the span of 20 years, one of the things that I discovered is that I had some deep talents and skills that I had really failed to acknowledge. Okay, and I think that that's one of the downsides of jumping into a corporate environment. They tend to get barnacled over, if you will, as you chase somebody else's dream, working for somebody. And I discovered as I got into my entrepreneurial world that not only was I not equipped to be an entrepreneur, but I was not acknowledging what was at the core of me in terms of my talents and skills. So that's been an interesting discovery process. And I did a lot of reading on that. And that's, somewhat down the road in that experience, I finally just had to say, okay, this is what I was wired up to do. This is what I want to do. This is what I'm good at. And then move more in that direction. I certainly don't advise people to try to make that discovery in their 60s or 70s. Do it as early as you can. And that would be the key piece of advice. I think if you do really want to launch out on your own, do it around what you're wired up to do and what you're good at. Don't do it for the money, which is what I did. And so it was later on that I just came to grips with the fact that, hey, I'm probably designed really to teach, learn, and write. And that's where I've been taking my life since. And I think I put that in the category of having a sense of purpose, because I believe that's what I feel. I feel I have that sense of purpose now, having made that discovery. This was kind of long and drawn out. It doesn't have to take that long. There's a lot of great resources out there to help you discover what's your essence. And I call it discovering your essence. I mean, we all have an essence. We tend to sometimes just not acknowledge it and leverage it. But so that would be a piece of advice, I guess, that I would extend to people, is to find out what your essence is.
So tell us what you learned from leaving the corporate world and then transitioning into your own gig. And you mentioned earlier about some advice that you have in terms of what to do and not to do.
Well, I'm more qualified to tell you what not to do.
Okay.
Well, and as I stated earlier, don't do it for the money. Do it for what really allows you to leverage what you're all about. And something that will give you a sustainable sense of purpose going forward. The other part of it is do some serious due diligence if you're gonna jump off the cliff into doing something on your own. Now, I didn't do that, and I ended up in the recruiting world without adequate training. So I lost a lot of time catching up and getting the right kind of training. And in that process, what I discovered that in the recruiting world, and nobody really equipped me for this, in the recruiting world is one of the most difficult sales positions that you can get into because you're dealing with an imperfect product on both ends, called people. It's very difficult business, very gratifying business. And I have deep respect for people in that profession, especially those who are successful at it. But it has a high mortality rate because there's a high rejection rate. So I found, frankly, my discovery in the recruiting world was it wasn't the ideal thing for me to be doing because I didn't like one part of the recruiting business. I didn't like the hunting part, if you will, going out and getting the job orders and that sort of thing. But what I did love was engaging candidates who were in that career transition position. Some were making major life decisions. I loved engaging people like that with those kind of topics. And from that was an evolution, ultimately getting away from the recruiting world and more into coaching, life coaching, career transition coaching. And that in turn has led to really honoring my writing, my motivation to write, because resume writing and LinkedIn profile development all for creation, writing, creative writing. So it satisfies that part of me as well. Plus, I think helping people and allows me to stay in that coaching environment. So it was a long evolution to come to that. And again, I encourage people to try to make that discovery of your essence as early as you can, hopefully back in your 50s or 60s, so that, the bottom line is people in their 50s or 60s, if they're taking care of themselves, they've got a long runway. It could be a runway of 25, 30, 35, 40 years. What are you going to do with that? Well, I simply suggest find out what you're good at, what you like to do, and spend your time in those years doing that. And it doesn't have to be, stressful type of work. It can be work that's very gratifying, or if maybe it's even a lifestyle business, that allows you to build something and at the same time maintain a lifestyle that's appropriate for you. So
how did you pivot from being a recruiter to doing what you're doing now?
How did I pivot from being a recruiter to it? Well, again, it was just kind of an evolution. I had purchased a recruiting business that was more of a local business than a national business. And as it turned out, it ended up being kind of on life support due to some changes in the marketplace. I tried to sustain that for 3 or 4 years or to build it back up unsuccessfully. And I just said, look, this is just not where I need to be. In the process of doing all this recruiting, though, I had worked with lots of people on resume development. I did a lot of co-creation, if you will, of resumes with folks. And then I ended up contracting with a well-known healthcare outplacement company that places C-level executives. They don't place, they help healthcare executives who are in transition under an outplacement arrangement, and they needed some help as a resume writer. So I threw in with them, got a certification in both that and in LinkedIn profile development, and decided that's what I do. And I just kind of abandoned the recruiting part of it. So, but I stay in touch with a lot of the recruiters in the field because I understand that field. And I think that brings a dimension to what I do that not every resume writer has. I can talk to folks, from a recruiter's perspective. But that's really what led to the abandonment. I'm just more satisfied, I think, and I find this more gratifying than being a recruiter, quite honestly.
So I'm 62 years old and I just got laid off from my company. What advice do you have for me when I come to you to help me redo my resume and my LinkedIn profile?
You're 53 and you just got laid off?
No, 62.
62. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I encourage people, I've got a very comprehensive discovery worksheet that I have people go through. It's an 18-question worksheet. And it's really designed to have them think deeply about, okay, what have I really achieved? You know, what can I claim, especially if I can quantify it, if I can put a metric on it? What have I done in my work history that's been high impact for the people that I work for? How did I move the needle, you know, with those organizations? What were the results? Because I think that a couple of things happen. Number one, people tend to forget about the impact that they've had. They don't keep track of the little things that they've done that have had impact. And this is designed to kind of bring those back to the surface, because a hiring manager or a recruiter is going to look for that. Okay. And most frankly, most resumes that I looked at are poorly designed. That, you know, they're responsibility based, they're not achievement based. So that's what I do. As I said, look, we need to bear down on what it is that you've really done that's significant. So, and then at the same time, I encourage them to really gather up, if you will, what are your deepest skills? What are you really good at? Because that is important for us to build into the LinkedIn profile as well as the resume, but it also helps them prepare for interviews. So I think it's all really kind of built around that, Bob. I think it's digging in, identifying what that essence is, what your core skills are, what you've done with that, and being able to put that out there as a story. Because what is a resume and a LinkedIn profile? Fundamentally, it's a story. And that's what I help people do, is to tell their story in a way that you demonstrate that you are a problem solver for people who are looking for problem solvers. I mean, that's really what it gets down to. So I hope that answers your question, but that's the way I view it. And, you know, the recruiter perspective is helpful in that regard.
Sure. How important are keywords in a resume or in a profile?
Well, they're very important from a couple of perspectives. You know, a resume is almost always going to be read by a bot. It's going to be read by an applicant tracking system. So they're going to be looking for particular keywords or keyword phrases. But so are recruiters who are actually scanning through a resume visually. So yeah, you have to build those into the resume, but they need to be appropriate to the job orders or the jobs that you're considering. In the space that I'm in with healthcare executives, it's a pretty broad list of keywords, but it's pretty consistent from one to the next, because the problems that we have in this broken healthcare system are pretty much universal, if you will. So one of the things I do is I just help them. I have people send me copies of jobs that they're applying for or interested in. And we search those for keywords and try to build those into the resume. We can't capture everything. And we can't design a resume to adopt to 250 different applicant tracking systems out there either. But we try to reach a balance. But I think more importantly is that it's got to be achievement based, and it's got to tell a story. And that's where I try to go with folks. And I think that's the creative writing part that I find so satisfying in terms of developing these resumes. So I hope that answers your question.
It does.
Hey, Gary, I want to go back to your discovery process of figuring out what you ultimately wanted to do. I know this took you a little bit of time to figure it out, and we all agree that people need to begin this process as early as possible prior to retirement in order to figure out if they're going to make that transition, what they ultimately will do, how they're going to spend their time, where they're going to get their purpose from, all of those different things. What I think we see, all three of us kind of see, is that people get into that, or they make that transition. They make the transition, or they they believe that when they get to that point of making that transition, that they'll figure it out. So they haven't done any of this discovery process. If they don't do that and they get into retirement, what all of us see is that people tend to get stuck. They're not sure what to do, how to figure out what to do next. So do you have any advice on how to, I don't know if speed up that discovery process, but be able to figure that out so that people don't get stuck and are kind of wasting those first few years of retirement trying to figure things out?
Well, I think perhaps the advice that I'm most comfortable with on that topic is, especially if you talk about couples that are entering into, or they're approaching that retirement phase, is get an early start on trying to figure out what you want that period to look like. And I think that's where most people fall down. They go off the cliff and then try to figure it out, to your point.
Yep.
So I just encourage people individuals or couples, let's crank up the communication about what you want that to look like. And there's several components to that. Number one is, when I've coached people that are in that retirement planning phase, I start with the healthcare component. I say, look, all the planning that you're going to do goes for naught if you're sick. Okay. So I encourage people to say, okay, let's take a look at your lifestyle. What's your lifestyle? Is it a lifestyle that will sustain you and keep you healthy during this period? And it's also a way to identify perhaps some lifestyle issues. But I start there, but then I just encourage them to really open up the communication and acknowledge the fact that typically for couples, there are differences, okay, between the two in terms of what they find satisfying, gratifying, what motivates them, what drives them. And I think there's an important understanding between two people to know what those are and honor them, okay? And I think that's where a lot of problems develop. You'll have husband on one page, a wife on another page, and they're not talking about it. Or if you take an individual, a single individual that's in retirement, again, refusing to acknowledge what's deep down inside of themselves that they would find satisfying over this extended period of retirement, if you want to call it that. So I think I think those are key components to it. Communicate. And at the same time, you have to factor in that, and I've used the analogy a lot, is that retirement's like an iceberg. Only an eighth of it really is visible when you get into it. There's a lot of things underneath that are going on that you need to be prepared for, and you can't plan for everything, but hopefully there's conversation about some of the things that could come up, whether it's family issues, relocation issues, health issues. A lot of things can pop up. And if you're talking and thinking about those in advance, then you're going to be better prepared to handle them as they come up. So, but I think that's important. Especially, I think it's important to get that started before you get in. But it's not too late if you're into your retirement. You're still adjustment. But I think that's where people get stuck. And and it kind of, to me, Reed, it just kind of circles back to the fact that if you can adopt this commitment to finding a sense of purpose in that remaining period of your life, makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah. I think continuing to explore fits into that too, Gary, because we need to continue to try to find that right path or right direction. And for some people that does take them a little bit of time to figure it out. I also think there's people who give up a little early in the process. They try a few things and it doesn't work out, and they just don't have that kind of inside them to continue to look for and try different things and pursue what's really important to them.
I think it's kind of a contrast. I mean, you really have a choice, I guess, in retirement phase to be what I call a self-indulgent consumer, right? Versus the opposite of that would be a selfless creator, if you will, or a giver as opposed to a taker. And I think ultimately, I believe this very strongly. I think ultimately we are wired up to serve.
Yeah.
That's where we find the most satisfaction in our lives. If we're in a position where we're serving, and retirement brings us right face to face with that. Am I going to be a self-indulgent consumer for the rest of my life, or am I going to have a sense of purpose and give back, if you want to call it that? I think that plays a big role in longevity. We know clearly that work is one of the key components to longevity. Now that hasn't been the message we've been receiving for 5 or 6 decades now, that says, work is something you want to run away from and you want to create a life of leisure. And we know that leisure and happiness are 2 different things, believe me. So I think that's a pivotal decision to make. Am I gonna find something that's going to give me a sense of purpose, because it'll impact my health, my longevity, my attitude, my moods, my emotions, all of that sort of thing. So,
yeah, all those areas, all those.
I mean,
yeah,
I can share with you my own personal perspective on this is that I consider myself semi-retired for life.
Yeah.
Okay. I think of, if you can kind of envision a triangle with 3 points on it, and I advocate a balanced lifestyle of labor, leisure, and learning.
Yep.
Those are the 3 components that really kind of drive my life. And I will tell you right now, those are never in equal balance, and they never should be, because there's no such thing as a totally balanced lifestyle. But right now, for me, because I'm adding another dimension to what I do in my resume and LinkedIn profile world, I'm very heavy into the labor side of it. I never stop learning. Learning is something I do every day. But the leisure side of my life right now is really kind of non-existent. Maybe an occasional golf game and playing my guitar in the evening. But other than that, right now I'm focused on labor, because I see a longer picture of playing a longer game. And I want to really prop up this business with some new dimensions to it. My intent is to get a better balance of those 3, but that's really kind of the guiding light for me. How am I doing across that triumvirate, if you will, of labor, leisure, and learning? And with no intention of ever completely retiring. I mean, if I can manage my schedule and do what I want to do, when I want to do it, where I want to do it, and as much as I want to do it, why would I ever want to consider retirement?
I agree.
There's no question about that. But many times what happens is people get retired before they're ready for it, because we live in a just-in-time society. And people tend to focus on what's right in front of them. And they, as you point out, you really need to focus on the long term here. But the fact of the matter is that we live in a society that is rife with ageism. And for some reason, people just feel once you turn 65, there's an expiration date on your forehead.
Right.
And it kind of moves you into the world of entrepreneurism almost. So what advice do you have, or what have you seen to get people to understand this whole idea about purpose, their purpose, and then to be able to then take that purpose and meld it into the 3 points that you talked about?
Well, it's a great question, and it is a challenge. I mean, I have to really kind of come back to the simple Venn diagram, which both of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. It gets tagged as the Ikigai, the Japanese Ikigai Venn diagram, right? Which is the intersection of the 4 things that I mentioned earlier. Is it, what are you good at? What do you really enjoy doing? What can you get paid for to do it? And something that contributes, gives back, or provides a valid service to people. And the intersection of those 4 really is having that sense of purpose. And that's that's what I've been striving to get to, and I think and finally getting there now with what I do. So that would be my advice to someone: is can you address those four things? You know, I'm entering into a coaching arrangement this weekend with a young man who was an entrepreneur mostly all of his life in the healthcare field, doing supply chain management, and the market has shifted, and his business just dissolved. Okay. This is after 25 years of being a successful entrepreneur. And now he's out there saying, oh, God, what do I do now? Well, I'm excited to be able to engage him because he's in his late 50s, mid to late 50s. And I just want to help him find himself. I mean, I'm not going to tell him what to do, because if I did that, I wouldn't be a coach. But what I want to help him discover is his inner core, his talents and skills that he can translate forward into something, because he's also a health advocate, you know, mid 50s, probably got a 30 to 40 year runway. He just doesn't know what that's going to look like. Well, I'm excited to be able to maybe help him discover that. And I think that's really going to be him finding it himself. I mean, I think a good coach is just nothing but a light on the path. And so I'm looking forward to that. And I suspect that the word retirement is going to come up at some point in time, and he's going to say, well, how am I going to deal with retirement? Well, I think you can know where I'm going to go with that. I'm going to say, you know, let's rethink it. Let's say, do we even need to be thinking of it in a traditional sense? And that's where I would frankly just suggest maybe you want to consider a semi-retired life for the rest of your life, doing what you like to do, what you're good at, and can support you. So, I'll test it this weekend. I've tested it with a few other folks successfully, and I'll see how it goes with this gentleman. But to me, that's a world that is out there for a lot of people. Would you agree, Bob?
Oh, there's no question about that. No question about that.
Gary, you wrote a recent post titled, "Can we unteach traditional retirement? Maybe we should." And you discuss how the education and healthcare industries are ripe for disruption. You also point out that retirement is kind of that third entrenched concept that needs disruption. So I think you maybe just touched on this a little bit, but how can we help people unlearn, or can we unteach retirement to people? And what do we need to do to do that?
Oh boy, where do you start? Well, I think
What are some simple things
with this? But yeah, one of the things that I think you just have to look at the data. You have to look at the evidence. Okay, and not everybody's going to agree with me on this, and I'd probably get pilloried by scientists on this. But because I'm a health and wellness advocate, and you look at where we're going. I mean,
yeah,
we're sick as a culture. We are metabolically ill, and I frankly tie a little bit of that whole mindset to that, because when you move into retirement, let's face it, there are components of retirement that take you the wrong way biologically. Okay, whether it's sedentary living, sometimes the diet changes, your social circle begins to shrink. That voice activated remote and the lazy boy becomes very attractive. There's just and then you look at the statistics. We're going backwards on our longevity. Have been for the last 10 years. A lot of that's related to diet, but sedentary living is in there as well. So when we decide to head that direction, I think we're insensitive to the downsides of all that. I think you have to look at that evidence and say, okay, there's something wrong with this model. And I think we can go to school, quite frankly, on what's developing in the Gen X and the millennial sectors of our culture. They're going to be teaching us something. They're going to set the new trend lines. We're already seeing it. You may be familiar with a young fellow that's writing a lot about this right now. His name is Rocco Pendola. And Rocco has a newsletter he calls Never Retire. And he builds a pretty, I didn't agree with everything that Rocco says, but he makes a pretty compelling argument for not retiring, but thinking about not retiring when you're back in your 20s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and instead of adhering to the linear life model of learn, earn, adjourn, and die, you figure out what it is you want to do and what you're good at early in your life, and you stick with that and you get better at it, and you just say, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life, and I'm going to do it on my schedule, and you know, under my terms. But it also calls for a change in lifestyle. It's not based on accumulation like we've known it in our era, if you will. It's built around living a more sensible lifestyle, keeping the overhead manageable. And I think, Reed, you and I think, Bob, you may have been part of this too. I heard an interview recently of a young, I think he's an early Gen Xer or a late millennial who has a financial planning company. And he's very much tuned into this. And his audience are millennials and early Gen Xers. And he approaches them from a whole different perspective than what a typical financial planner does. And it's kind of couched in this whole concept of, let's just forget about the retirement concept. Let's talk about life, the long game of life, and doing what you're good at and what you want to do, and doing it your whole life. You don't have to have an end date to it. You can do it as long as you want to. Why not do it all the way to the end?
Yeah,
I find that refreshing. I had to wait till I was in my 70s to make that discovery, but you know, I think that we're going to see that trend line begin to develop now in the younger generation. So, which I think is healthy, quite frankly. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that's kind of the way I view it.
No, it definitely is healthy, and you're right. You do see it with a lot of millennials. They're doing a lot of different things, and I think COVID had a big impact on that also.
No question. Yeah.
Especially if they're in a kind of a middle management position. A lot of self-reflection went on. A lot of that self-reflection usually happens in your mid-50s, and now it seems to be happening more in their mid-30s. So I agree with you 100%.
No, I applaud that observation. I think you're absolutely right, Bob. It's kind of moving back down the age scale here, and that's healthy. You know, frankly, I mean, my age cohort, you know, to try to introduce these new kinds of ideas, like trying to penetrate concrete. So,
yeah.
You know, I find that the younger folks, a couple generations behind me, are a little bit more receptive to some of the ideas that I'm espousing at this point. You know, I've blown a number of dinner parties apart with my opinions, so pretty good at doing that.
Well, if you need some assistance, we're always available for weddings or dinner parties or whatever you want, Gary. All right.
Yeah, looking for a party pooper, that would be me. It's a well-practiced role. So,
hey Gary, from anything so you're writing, like on your website, I know that readers can comment. I know you've written for Quora, answered some questions on there. I know that you write the Ask the Retirement Coach section on Booming Encore. From all of that kind of writing and from your coaching, is there anything that kind of has stood out to you, or kind of themes that you're seeing kind of come out from those comments or from your conversations with people? Are they changing their thinking about retirement? Are they asking different types of questions now than maybe what you saw 3 or 5 years ago?
Well, you know, my weekly blog doesn't garner a whole lot of comments, but I find them to be fairly consistent in terms of, I guess, agreeing with the position that I'm taking on these things. I think, and I've had some folks offer up some really creative ideas on how they're approaching life, and every one of them is an individual. But at the heart of it is this acknowledgement that I ain't done yet. You know, I've got a lot to bring to the party. And I think there is, in fact, some resentment to the fact that there is a component out there that doesn't buy into it and is critical of it. You know, I've been espousing for probably the better part of a decade now that I intend to live past 100. Well, I'll tell you what, you drop that into a conversation of your age cohort, and you know they'll put you in the broom closet, because that's, you know, they're just not interested in that. Because, and yeah, you understand it. What's the visual that comes up when they hear that?
Yeah.
You know,
right.
all they think of needles and wheelchairs and nurses and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that way. So, but I think the younger generation, they watched us. They watched the Reeds and the Bobs and the Garys out there and said, "Nah, I don't think so. That's not for me. I'm not going to knock myself out for 45 years building somebody else's dream, and then have physical problems, mental problems, or whatever you want to call them for the balance of my life." And that's why, you know, and I simply go back to the statistics. So you look at, in America, in our illness, we only average right now, I think the average male longevity is like 76 years, going backward. But I think the important statistic is that on the average, and Ken Dykewald writes a lot about this, we endure 12 to 15 years of ill health toward the ends of our lives on average in the country. And that's, to me, that doesn't make sense. But you almost have to take it back. You know, I use the front nine, back nine analogy. I borrowed that from Dan Zeman, who's a physiotherapist. You know, if you haven't played your front nine pretty well, then your back nine might be a little rough. And I'm a living example of that. I mean, I smoked till I was 37. I didn't get serious about physical fitness until I was well into my 40s. But, you know, I've got above average health for someone my age, but only because I started playing my back nine a little bit differently. A lot of people wake up too late. You know, it's going to take more than a grip change and a stance change to resolve the back nine. It may take some pretty radical shifts in lifestyle. I'm not sure many people are willing to do that. And that's where I think retirement comes in and just messes it up. Because we bought into, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. You know, I'm supposed to take it easy. You know, I'm supposed to stop learning. You know, I'm supposed to watch Netflix or whatever you want to call it. And I think I don't know how much longer we're going to ignore that statistic, but we got to wake up at some point. That's why, you know, I mentioned the whole thing about education and healthcare and retirement are all subject to disruption, because I think that's all part and parcel of it. So.
Yep. I think
no question about it. You know, it's kind of like retirement's almost looked upon like senior spring break, you know, where every day is Saturday. And
senior spring. Can I steal that? I like that. Seniors.
I haven't copyrighted it yet, so.
Okay, I'll steal it.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop for today. Bob, Gary, any final comments you'd like to make before we end today?
Yeah, I just say let's collectively, for those of us in the, I can't put me in that category, but in the 40, 50, 60 age category, come on, let's rise up. Let's unleash all this accumulated skills and talent and experience, and let's turn it around to good. I mean, heavens knows we've got a culture and a society that's busted, and it needs that accumulated wisdom to help turn it. And so let's not buy into going out to pasture. Let's collect all that back up. Let's turn it loose. Let's use it for good in service of others and fixing some of the problems that we've got out there. I get incensed when I think about the wasted talent that we're shoving into warehouses that are buying into this outdated model. And just kind of going off the charts, just disappearing. I mean, it didn't make sense. And I would just encourage people to say, join this revolution, and let's get some things fixed. We know how to do it. We got the patience and we got the experience. We got the knowledge. Let's keep using it. So
Yep.
That's my soapbox.
Perfect close, Gary. Thanks for joining us, everybody, on today's episode. We'll see you next time when we continue exploring retirement and longevity planning beyond the numbers. After ending the last episode with Gary Foster, I realized we didn't share Gary's contact information at the end, so I wanted to share that with you. Gary's website is makeagingwork.com, and on Gary's website, make sure to read his blog. You can also sign up to receive his weekly articles. Gary's been writing articles for over 5 years on his website. He always has fabulous content. The blog's makeagingwork.com, and you can just go to the blog tab. You can email Gary with any questions at gary@makeagingwork.com, and you can connect with Gary on LinkedIn, Gary Allen Foster. And if you have any questions for myself or Bob Foley, my co-host, our contact information is on the right. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.